is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Threat of hunger in Ethiopia's Tigray region draws international concerns. The World Health Organization warns that gains made against COVID-19 at risk of being eroded. And we look at how a woman in the DR Congo is helping to transform the lives of soldiers' wives and widows. Hello and welcome to Africa Live. As always, great to have you with us. I'm Richard Nta, live in Nairobi. And for those of you joining us from across the continent and around the globe, we thank you for joining us. Let's take a look at other stories making headlines this hour. Alarm raised in Uganda over possible links between human trafficking and foreign job recruitments. And in sports, despair in Cairo as Brazil knocks out Egypt in Olympic men's football quarterfinals. Once again, welcome to Africa Live. So good to have you with us. We begin with what could be the unfolding of a serious humanitarian crisis in Ethiopia's Tigray region. The UN Children's Agency, UNICEF, estimates that more than 100,000 children are at risk of life-threatening malnutrition in the next 12 months. And for the latest on this, let's go on to the phone to Addis Ababa, where Garoom Chala is standing by. Garoom, welcome to Africa Live. Thank you for joining us here on the program. Garoom, what are the underlying factors contributing to the dire situation being witnessed in the Tigray region?
Richard, as you know, the most important factor for the unfolding humanitarian crisis or even making it worse is the ongoing conflict in different locations in the Tigray regional state and in bordering towns between the Tigray regional state and Amhara and also the Tigray regional state in Afar. There are conflicts being reported at the moment. And also the access to humanitarian services is also one of the factors that we can also talk about contributing for the worsening of the situation. The government is saying that it is the TPLF militia and the forces there which are preventing the access for humanitarian deliveries. Trucks filled with humanitarian aid are still stuck in different locations in the country, and this should be allowed so that people can get access to this humanitarian aid. The TPLF, although communication is still a problem, as we always report, are saying that it is the government to blame. All in all, we have to understand that the humanitarian suffering is continuing, and the UN is echoing its concerns at the moment, Richard.
Well, important and significant points that you have made there, Garoom. What interventions are being made, though, by authorities in Ethiopia? And what more can the international community do to alleviate the suffering in Tigray?
So there are two sides of two answers for this important question you have asked, Richard. The first one is the government is saying that it is doing its level best through the Commission for Disaster and Risk Management Commission, which is, by the way, providing food from the beginning of the war in that regional state 9 months ago, and is still continuing to provide food, shelter, and also basic amenities for the people who have been affected by the ongoing conflict in the Tigray regional state. So the government is saying it is trying to deliver everything that the people need, although it is not enough. And it has been calling the international community to work with it so that this can be also be a success story to talk about. As you've said, the international community has a great stake in this. The government still is complaining that the international community did not really come forward as it is expected because there are so many people who are in need of help. The Tigray regional state, even before the conflict, has millions of people which are helped by the government's incentive plans, and now that has become worse. So the combination work, the work being done between the international community and the government is what is expected to come up with a better results for these people, and that is what we are expecting to see in the coming few days if the conflict subsides, Richard.
Indeed, distressful scenes we are witnessing there, Gurum. Gurum, as always, great reporting. Thank you so much for that update and report. The Horn of Africa region has been suffering from multiple famines as a result of both drought and conflict. The UN estimates nearly 260,000 people were killed during the 2011 famine in Somalia. 50% of those who perished were children. The UN declared an end to the famine in February 2012. For some, however, the effects of the 2011 drought and famine are still being felt.
We are worried. For example, currently we plant tomatoes, onions, hot pepper and other vegetables. This costs a lot of money, and if misfortunes happen again and everything goes away, our life will be at risk.
This was the worst drought in Somalia for about 60 years. We can attribute the cause of this drought to the fighting which was going on in many parts of southern central Somalia, absence of expected rainfalls for about 5 consecutive years, and lack of timely response on the food and water shortages by the Somali authorities and the international community.
Meanwhile, the World Health Organization has warned that the world is at risk of losing hard-won gains in fighting COVID-19. It says COVID-19 infections have increased by 80% over the past 4 weeks, much of this due to the highly transmissible Delta variant spreading across the globe. Tuli Shabalala has more.
The U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has described the Delta variant of the coronavirus as being as transmissible as chickenpox. The Delta variant has been detected in 132 countries. Infections have nearly doubled over the past 4 weeks.
Since our last press conference, cases and deaths from COVID-19 have continued to climb. Almost 4 million cases were reported to WHO last week. And on current trends, we expect the total number of cases to pass 200 million within the next 2 weeks. And we know that is an underestimate.
Health systems in many countries are being overwhelmed.
WHO has warned that the COVID-19 virus has been changing since it was first reported, and it continues to change. So far, 4 variants of concern have emerged, and there will be more as long as the virus continues to spread. The rise is also driven by increased social mixing and mobility, the inconsistent use of public health and social measures, and inequitable vaccine use. Hard-won gains are in jeopardy or being lost, and health systems in many countries are being overwhelmed.
In Africa, deaths have increased by 80% over the past month. Only 1.5% of the population is vaccinated.
Do you really accept 1.5% vaccination in Africa, while in some countries it's already 70%? Don't we need a platform like the Olympics to go and tell the truth that the world is actually morally, epidemiologically, and economically is doing the wrong things? Is it really wrong to go to the mountaintop of the Olympics to call for solidarity? Are you saying that's wrong? I hope not. So that's why I went.
The WHO is urging governments to continue vaccinating their citizens.
The Delta variant is a challenge, as the other variants have been. But remember, the diagnostics that we have all around the world still work very effectively against all of the variants, and we can detect the disease quite successfully. And in terms of vaccination, the vaccines that are currently approved by WHO all provide significant protection against severe disease and hospitalization for all the variants, including the Delta variant. So it's important. We are fighting the same virus, but a virus that's become fitter and better adapted to transmitting amongst us humans. That's the change.
The global health body is calling on countries across the world to act before more dangerous variants emerge. Noktula Shabalala, CGTN.
Senegal is battling a third wave of COVID-19 infections. The West African country recorded just over 1,000 cases on Friday alone. Across the country, COVID-19 wards are almost at full capacity. The government hopes vaccination drives will help stop the spread of the virus. Asta Tall takes a closer look for us.
COVID-19 cases are rising sharply in Senegal, leaving authorities worried. In the capital, Dakar, COVID-19 wards have reached 100% capacity. As healthcare workers struggle to deal with the influx of cases, the government is turning to preventative measures.
During the first campaign with Sinopharm and AstraZeneca, people still came. But it's not like this time. Every day, we reach around 800 to 850 people a day. During the first campaign, it was around 400 to 450 people a day.
Senegal kicked off its immunization drive in February. Misinformation surrounding COVID-19 and vaccine safety initially resulted in hesitancy from parts of the population. Now, the country is recording a positivity rate of over 25%. This has pushed more people to get vaccinated.
At first, I didn't believe it because there were rumors that the vaccines are not safe and I was afraid. But then I thought it would be much better to get vaccinated in the current situation.
We are all seeing the negative effects of this pandemic. All activities are stopped. The country's economy is affected. We count the deaths every day. Only the vaccine could allow us to resume our normal activities. People have to believe in it so that we can get out of it.
Beyond receiving vaccine doses from the COVAX initiative, Senegal is looking to manufacture COVID-19 vaccines. The country will begin producing vaccines in 2022 in partnership with Universal, a Belgian biotech group. Asta Tall, CGTN.
A number of developed countries with high vaccination rates are relaxing border controls to allow for travel. But it may be a while before people in African countries are afforded the same freedom of movement, with only a small percentage of the population vaccinated. CGTN's Julie Shire reports.
Slowly but surely, international travel is returning, and if you're fully vaccinated, the world is your oyster again. With the UK lifting quarantine restrictions for British travellers, life seems to be easier when venturing abroad. But what does that mean to South Africa and the continent, where the majority of the population is still not vaccinated?
It's a good sign that we are going to coexist with the pandemic. I think that's the most important message out there, is that for as long as you've got a negative test, you're vaccinated, traveling the world is open to you.
Less than 3% of the African population have so far been jabbed. As a result, South Africa and other countries on the continent remain red-listed and are unlikely to benefit from a restart in travel.
They will come, but they will not come in the numbers that they usually come because they're on the red list. So they will obviously prefer destinations where people are vaccinated. We do obviously require the help of the private sector to ensure that we vaccinate the population and be able to open the economy.
South Africa's tourism industry has been one of the hardest hit sectors. With the highest infection rate on the African continent, it may take some convincing from visitors to return.
It's very difficult, going into a discussion when you're in the peak of a pandemic. But now we're in that position, I think, coming down, showing how we've managed, showing that we've got, definitely got an amazing health response. Even if we have to start engaging as a regional government with the EU, with the UK, with the US to say, how do we get onto a different level listing?
The country has also suffered huge reputational damage after a recent spate of civil unrest.
So tourism industry is very, very uncomfortable on bad publicity, strikes, protests. And what happened in Durban has a detrimental impact on the image of brand Durban and also brand South Africa. Because 2 or 3 years ago, we had xenophobic violence just before the tourism in Durban, which had a bad reputation for South Africa.
The African continent remains on the back foot as a result of inequitable access to vaccines. Until such time, where countries are able to significantly boost vaccinations, travel in and out of these regions will remain slow. Julie Shara, CGTN, Cape Town, South Africa.
Well, amidst the high-pitched deep whistle of the COSCO Sao Paulo ship under COSCO Shipping, nearly 1,000 XCMG construction machines, including excavators, wheel loaders, and graders, set sail from Leon Yungang port, heading towards South America. Now, this is the largest single batch export in Chinese construction machinery industry over the past 5 years. Now, this batch is expected to arrive in the port of destination in mid-August. The consignment is destined for a major infrastructure construction project in South America. It is also an important practice for Chinese shipping enterprises and foreign trade enterprises to strengthen cooperation and solve difficulties of foreign trade shipment together. This plays a positive role in global supply chain stability, especially during the prevailing pandemic. According to official data, in the first half of this year, Chinese foreign trade import and export reached RMB 18.07 trillion, a year-on-year increase of 27.1%. Monthly import and export showed an upward trend for 13 consecutive months.
The pandemic has swept across industrial economies of many countries, while the rapid recovery of the Chinese industrial and supply chain has caused China to be more needed in global import and export trade.
A Congolese woman who lost her husband and 3 children in a rebel attack more than 2 decades ago is now helping to transform the lives of soldiers' wives and widows. Jenna Rose Wavita fled the east of the Democratic Republic of Congo in 2001 and settled in Kinshasa, where she is training women to cook and bake to make a living. CGTN's Chris Ochemringa has more from Kinshasa.
Taking a trip down memory lane, Jenna Rose Wavita reminisces about the good old days she had with her husband and children. Her husband was a soldier who got killed by rebels in a village called Kasika in eastern DRC in 1998. She sought refuge inside a church with 4 of her children, but the rebels stormed the church and killed 3 of them.
Seeing my husband and 3 children lying dead on the same day was a very traumatizing experience for me. All our belongings were stolen. I just didn't know how to start rebuilding my life.
Jenna Rose found hope at a camp for displaced people where she was trained to cook and bake. Now in Kinshasa, she's transferring those skills to widows and wives of soldiers so they too can make money from baking.
The problem that most Congolese face is unemployment. We have to struggle on our own to survive because our country has very few jobs. That's the reason I chose to train women to bake. The money they get from selling cakes helps them support their families.
For many of these women, Jenna Rose's training has been life-changing.
I used to beg people for money to buy bread for my kids. I really suffered. My life has totally changed after I was taught to bake cakes and make pastries by Madame Jean Rose.
Some Congolese army officers are also proud of the skills their wives have received.
My fellow soldiers have started taking their wives to get trained to bake and cook after seeing the change that has happened in my life. We hope Madame Generosi gets financial support to open a larger training center.
Jenna Rose is now well known in military circles for the training she offers women in the barracks. Many wives of soldiers in the DRC go through a long and difficult process of getting their husband's pension after they die. But those with skills like Jenna Rose Wavita are able to fend for themselves and even train others to try and make a difference in society. Chris Ochemringa, CGTN, Kinshasa, Democratic Republic of Congo.
To Libya now, where warring sides have reopened the main coastal road across the front line. The move is seen as a key element of a ceasefire they agreed last year involving months of negotiations. The road stretches along the length of Libya's coastline. It is cut between the cities of Misrata and Sirte, where the front line stabilized last summer. The road is, however, not open to military traffic. The agreement also includes some preparatory steps for the withdrawal of foreign fighters, another part of last year's ceasefire that still has to be implemented. The road opening is expected to make an immediate difference to people who previously had to fly or make long, hard overland journeys across the country. All right, let's move on to an anti-human trafficking campaigners in Uganda. And they are growing increasingly worried by operations of external labor recruitment companies. They warn that some of these companies have become an avenue for human trafficking. CGTN's Hilary Ayasega reports. Let's take a look.
Nearly 2 years ago, Joan Namiga thought she was going to the United Arab Emirates to work as a maid. Instead, the 24-year-old ended up in the hands of a trafficker who transferred her to another person. Her woes began when she demanded for her wages.
These are the scars from the beatings I got. The torture began in September last year when I was demanding payment for the 9 months I had worked.
She managed to break free 4 months ago and is now back home with her family. Campaigners say young women like Joan are lured with promises of good-paying jobs. The recruitment companies are then paid in advance for movement of the migrant workers.
This person works as a broker because he has to get this money and make sure that these girls, they are taken there. So by the time the migrant workers are gotten to be recruited, the director has already eaten maybe the money. So this one who will come and want to be recruited will be recruited under a lot of influence. One, there is fear. One, there is also deception. They are deceived day and night. You will work with your phone. The first thing you reach there, your phones are taken away.
For the brokers, it's a lucrative business. Each person they traffic can bring in a commission of $2,000 or more. Uganda has over 200 labor exporting companies. Campaigners say in the last 3 years, they've rescued over 300 young women that were trafficked abroad. To curb the problem, they want local authorities to manage the process of exporting labor instead of private companies. The government has already stripped 8 companies of their licenses on allegations of human trafficking.
There's fraud and there's deceit, in the process. And so if you're in that chain, please make sure that you clean up, even the companies clean up your supply chain.
Labor recruitment agencies say they are working with the government to eliminate companies that are tarnishing their image. According to the Trafficking in Persons report from 2020, over 7,000 children in Uganda are currently being exploited through sex trafficking. The activists are also urging local authorities to create more high-paying jobs at home so workers don't feel like they have to move abroad to make a living. The hope is these and more interventions could help protect young people like Namiga from being trafficked. Hilary Ayasega, CGTN, Kampala, Uganda.
Do not go away. We've got your sports news coming up after the break. Here's a peek at the headline. Despair in Cairo as Egypt are knocked out of the Olympic men's football quarterfinals by Brazil.
How would you create your legend? On the fields, on the tracks, in the arenas of Africa. Were you born to be a player? Could this moment be yours? Sports Scene. Find your game.
Welcome back to Sport on Africa Live. Let's talk a bit of Olympic football. Brazil has knocked out Egypt from the Tokyo 2020 football quarterfinals after the Pharaohs fell to a 1-0 defeat on Saturday morning, and that's after the Rio 2016 champions pressed their defense line and goalkeeper. CGTN's Adel El-Maroui brings us more.
Fans rushed to cafes to watch the Pharaohs play against Brazil in the Tokyo 2020 men's football quarterfinals. Full of hope that a miracle could be near, this turned out to be the last gathering to watch the Egyptian national team in Japan.
Based on their victory over Australia, I expected a better game from Egypt against Brazil. The level of play and the tactics were poorer. Something appeared to be wrong. I think Brazil did not exert their best, and they have put as little effort needed to defeat us. If they wanted to score more, I think they could have.
Coach Shawty began the match with a solid defense plan. Brazil's first shot on target was registered in the 28th minute. The Rio 2016 champions took the lead 10 minutes later, but could not add to their tally as Egypt held firm.
Brazil is a very strong team for the first 15 minutes. We couldn't cross into the half of the pitch. I was expecting a bigger defeat. Thank God for having Shanawi. He saved many goals, at least 3 goals. The national team could have been much better if the coach had chosen a different squad.
I expected that defeat. Brazil is of course stronger than us. We played against so many strong teams, but we were better this time. We've made it a hard victory for them. Hegazi and the Shenawi made sure of that. Without small mistakes, we would have seen a better result.
Egypt barely made it through the group stage. This is after being pulled against football giants Spain, Argentina and Australia. To many, the result of the match was inevitable, yet they were expecting a harsher defeat than just 1-0. So the Pharaohs go back home proud that they've done their best against the Brazilians. Adel Mahwi, CGTN, Cairo.
Star Nigerian female sprinter Blessing Okabari was kicked out of the Tokyo 2020 Olympics after she was provisionally suspended by the Athletics Integrity Unit this morning. Okabari, who was tipped for a medal, will not compete this afternoon in the 100 meters women's semifinals after an out-of-competition test came back positive for a human growth hormone. The 32-year-old Okabari, the Olympic long jump silver medalist at Beijing 2008 Games, had posted a time of 11.05 seconds in her 100 meters heat on Friday to qualify for the semis. And the 8th day of official competitions is over at the Olympic Games as host city Tokyo continues to report record daily COVID-19 infections. CGTN's John Matthews is in Tokyo and has the wrap-up of the day's events.
China has opened up its lead in gold medals, now up to 21 to second place Japan's 17. Now, the host nation did stall in Saturday's matches, missing a key gold in the judo mixed team final to France and legendary heavyweight judoka Teddy Riner. But Japan's 17 golds still put it in its winningest Olympics ever, beating the country's 16 gold performance in 2004 in Athens. China grabbed the very first gold in new Olympic sport, sailing, finishing first in the women's RSX windsurfer medal race. On the weightlifting side, world record holder Liu Xiaojun also picked up a gold in the men's 81 kilogram category, breezing by his competitors' final scores by 7 kilograms. Now, China's women's rugby sevens team also took a victory over the Russian Olympic team as they exited the tournament in 7th place, showing a growing competitiveness in sports not traditionally attributed to China. 21 more COVID-19 cases were reported associated with the Games on Saturday, bringing the total to 241. The IOC says it has stripped accreditation of a stakeholder who left the Olympic Village for a sightseeing trip. Meanwhile, Tokyo has once again reported a record high number of new daily COVID-19 cases at more than 4,000. The city is still in a state of emergency, but its streets still show plenty of hustle and bustle. John Matthews, CGTN, Tokyo.
Well, that's it for this edition of Africa Live. Remember, you can send us your feedback to the contacts on the screen and follow us on digital media platforms. Remember, I'll see you at the top of the hour with Sports Scene. Keep it right here on CGTN. We have Talk Africa next with Beatrice Marshall.
is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
COVID-19 has caused a multifaceted global crisis with devastating impacts on the lives of people and the global economy. One of the areas affected by the pandemic is wildlife conservation, which adds on to the already existing challenges of habitat loss and poaching. The pandemic has exposed the fragility of wildlife conservation efforts in Africa. With limited funding for most state-run conservation agencies, there has been an over-dependence on tourism to support conservation efforts. And now, with global travel restrictions still in place, funds from tourism are drying up, putting wildlife protection and people's livelihoods in a major crisis. According to the International Union for Conservation of Nature, more than half of the listed protected areas in Africa reported that they were forced to stop or reduce field patrols and anti-poaching operations, as well as conservation, education and outreach. As a result, decades of conservation work is at risk of being undone. This week on the program, we ask, how much has COVID-19 impacted wildlife protection? And how can wildlife conservation and resources be saved while we battle for our own survival? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Well, let's broaden this discussion a little bit further and bring in our panel of guests. Joining us from Lagos, Peter Nta, the Executive Director of Wild Aid. From Nairobi via Zoom, Dr. Paula Kahumbu, the CEO Wildlife Direct. And in Cape Town via Zoom, Megan Carr, Head Researcher and in charge of Specialist Elephant Projects at EMS Foundation. A warm welcome to all of you and thank you very much for joining in this discussion. Paula, let me start with your perception on what's going on in terms of wildlife conservation. There is a perception that nature is getting a break from humans during the COVID-19 pandemic. What impact has the pandemic had on wildlife conservation and conservation efforts?
I think that some of the most obvious things is there's been a drop in the amount of available cash for conservation, which means that many of the protected areas are struggling, I would say, particularly when it comes to the private conservation areas and conservation areas managed by communities that don't depend on state funds. So there is a real challenge in keeping staff on board. And so many staff have gone on half pay. Many staff have been sent home across the continent. But I would also say that you're right. Animals have had a break. I've just come back from Masai Mara, where normally you can drive quite close to the lions. The lions might come very close to your vehicle. The lions have not seen vehicles for months. They've gone wild. They'll growl at you if you get too close. So I'm really thrilled to see nature returning, the natural behavior of animals returning, which is great. I think wildlife and the ecosystems needed that break.
But let's look at that drop in available cash to run conservancies or to run the projects that come with wildlife conservation. What is falling through the cracks as a result?
Several huge things. If you look at Kenya alone, if you go down to Amboseli National Park, one of Kenya's premier protected areas, the conservancies around them have no revenue. The conservancies are owned by individuals, right? Communities who now have title deeds. They are struggling for cash, and because they can't get it, they are selling their land. And that is huge. That means that land is moving out of the conservation landscape. It means the land resource is declining, and the land is being converted into other land uses. So what we have witnessed in Kenya is the emergence of farming. Right. So people who have cash have bought up the land, have started industrial scale farming in the wilderness areas, buffer zones, dispersal areas, and corridors. This is going to cause permanent damage for wildlife, especially migratory wildlife, which East Africa is really renowned for.
Right. Peter, let's get it from your view, because even before the pandemic, there was a lot of concern regarding the illegal trade in wildlife products. How has the pandemic affected the global consumption of wildlife products? Has there been a reduction in the demand for wildlife products?
Well, I think it's too early to say on the demand. I mean, we know that the prices for things like rhino horn and elephant ivory have been going down in recent years, largely due to the awareness getting better. But I don't think there's any studies been done since COVID to indicate the volumes. And we have seen some seizures of animals going on. But again, it's hard to say whether that's just customs have less business to go through, they can find it easier, or whether the volume's down. I think it'll be a few years before we really know what the net effects are. But the close down economic activity generally will have been good for consumption of wildlife. So if you look at the rhino situation in South Africa, the rhino poaching's been down by 50% in COVID year, because there's just so much less activity going on. It's harder for people to hide their illegal activity. So on the one side, that's been good. On the other side, you have communities, as Paula was saying, around the parks that maybe their income sources have collapsed, and maybe some of those communities turn to things like bushmeat poaching. And so it's a mixed bag, and I think it's too early to say net whether it's been good or bad for wildlife. But certainly, as is noted there, some wildlife has returned to former behavior. There's a report from Nepal that the rhino breeding has got better because there's so many less people around. The rhinos have more private time and actually able to breed better. But the long-term concern, as Paula says, is this loss of revenue to conservation efforts. And then I think loss of income to local communities that may lead them to turn towards poaching.
Megan, some good news coming out of South Africa there. As Peter mentioned, that the rhino population the poaching of rhino population has actually declined since the pandemic broke out. How do you explain this from South Africa?
Well, it's quite easy to explain. I was fortunate enough to be able to travel during our hard lockdown, and I traveled where in the rhino-rich areas of South Africa, in KwaZulu-Natal and Mpumalanga and Limpopo. All the roads around these reserves were closed. There was no human movement at all. So it meant that roads to Mozambique from South Africa were shut. It meant that you couldn't drive in and out of reserves. So it made life very difficult for any poachers to carry on any activity. There were roadblocks everywhere. So initially, our hard lockdown was meant to last for 3 weeks at the end of March, but it continued for very much longer, which did definitely deter poaching.
Right, but what's been the effect, though, Megan? Because conservationists were concerned that, because traditional economic and social systems had been disrupted as a result of the lockdowns, that this could have had an effect on poaching, and there could be a rise, but this has not turned out in South Africa, has it?
Well, there's two different theories here. First of all, we've been told by our minister that there is a massive decline in rhino numbers. So I think there are less rhino, for instance, to poach. It makes it more difficult. But what has increased is the poaching of traditional bush meat because people are hungry. So the poachers are now having to confront people that are hunting for food. This has increased and made life very difficult. And as Paula said, there's no funding coming in for the private reserves. So it's difficult for them to keep their security forces going.
Paula, the story is different, though, when it comes to the African forest elephant, now listed as critically endangered, and the African savanna elephant, also listed as endangered by the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species. What is the actual damage to them?
I think that the major threat to elephants now is not really poaching. Poaching will always be there at a certain level. And that depends very much on the demand and the ease with which people can move the ivory and the penalties or lack of enforcement. Sure, you'll see a bit more poaching. But as they've said, as the others have said, moving products around right now is difficult, especially big products like ivory is huge. It requires containers to move it. I think the biggest threat to elephants today is human-wildlife conflict. So many people have gone back to their villages. They have started farming because they don't have cash to get food anymore. So people are farming. That means there's more people in the landscape and sharing it with elephants. There are interactions which can be deadly. And what we're seeing in Kenya is a rise in the number of elephants being killed in retaliations. Not just elephants, lions and many other species are also affected. But I think that elephants, like so many other animals, when you lift threats to them, the populations can rebound again. With elephants, it's a bit slow because they're very slow breeders. But when you take the land away from these animals, you cause permanent damage. What we're seeing in East Africa is that the governments are now facing some very critical moments of decision making. At the beginning of the pandemic, it was thought it would just last a few months, and there were reserves, but those reserves have run out. So now the government of Kenya, for example, is considering, what are we going to do? We don't have the money in the government to fund these national parks. There's no tourism coming anytime soon, especially the remote parks. They're looking at very different methods of managing these conservation areas. They're talking of a form of privatization, PPPs, or what they're calling co-management, bringing in independent and international organizations to help run the parks. This, I think, is where we're going to see the biggest impact of COVID, because it's altering the philosophy of conservation, the policies, and the regulations. That is going to have long-lasting impact.
Right. So, Peter, I do want to come back to what Paula and yourself mentioned at the very beginning regarding the challenges that conservationists and organizations across the world, are facing now, because every country has a different story, and every country is, undertaking conservation measures in a different way as a result of the pandemic and lack of resources. What are the emerging patterns, though, that we are seeing in regards to wildlife conservation and how governments and organizations are dealing with conservation issues at this particular time?